Chapter 13. The Bleeding Daggers. Some people were slow in realising what had just happened. A few let out amazed or startled gasps. Some even thought that this was the opening scene of a play. After all, the musicians that were supposed to be playing throughout the meal hadn't made an appearance yet. And it was normal at these parties to have some kind of entertainment during the feast. Somewhere, one of the guests screamed. Somewhere, a child started to cry. The king rose from his chair. His face said it all. He was both horrified and livid at what he had just seen. Duke Quince and his champion knight Sir Bostone also rose from their chairs. With Cardus's killer right there at their table, their intent was only too clear. They intended to strike her down themselves. Sir Bostone had even grabbed the carving knife that had been left in the roast turkey that had been brought to their table. The servants all seemed to react as one. They stopped whatever they were doing and turned to look at the scene. Some of them began to look at each other, as if questioning what was happening. The servants seemed to have their own unspoken language, and were communicating with each other through subtle hand signals. Jenny's reaction was that of shocked silence. This couldn't be happening. This was her wedding day. She barely even heard the question that the prince seemed to be asking. Where did she get that dagger from? Surely she was searched before she was allowed anywhere near the king. No one is allowed in the great hall near the king with a weapon. That's why even the palace guards have to stay outside the hall. Klemper's reaction was quite strange. His gaze met that of both Duke Quince and Sir Bostone as they rose from their chairs. Then he brought his iron-shod staff down hard and firm on the marble floor with a resounding clang, while giving the two nobles a single order. Sit down! Duke Quince and Sir Bostone sat down very quickly. It almost looked to Jenny as if some invisible force had somehow thrown the two of them back into their chairs. With Klemper there, it wasn't hard to believe that was exactly what had happened. Klemper now turned his attention towards a serving girl who was still standing next to the corpse. The expression on her face seemed to suggest that the killing of the mage had been the most pleasurable experience she had ever had. Then as the shocked wedding guests watched, she flicked out her tongue quickly, barely touching the blood running down the blade. It was clear she was enjoying the attention. Kill her quickly, Klemper, the king ordered. He climbed to his feet. Kill her and get it over with. Let's not ruin my son's wedding any more than we have to. Klemper glanced quickly over his shoulder at the king and then back at the serving girl. I don't think so. Jenny just stared disbelieving at the scene, unsure she had seen or heard correctly. Klemper, the king ordered. I said kill her now. Klemper looked round sharply, his face scowled as he shouted back, Oh, shut up, you old fool. You're no longer in charge here. I am. What? The king said angrily. Sit down, Klemper ordered. There was a brief wave of his hand. The king was suddenly thrown back into his chair much the same way Duke Quince and his champion had been. In fact, Klemper shouted, bringing his staff down hard on the marble floor of the great hall, again with a resounding clang, everyone is to stay seated. Jenny saw that Prince Goti was trying to get out of his chair, but for some reason he couldn't even begin to stand up. Then she decided to try herself. It was a little awkward at first, but she found that she was able to lift herself up off the chair. She decided to keep her seat for now. If she was the only one of the wedding guests with any sort of mobility, then it was probably a good idea to keep that detail to herself. This is treason, the king shouted. Falid, strike down the traitor. Falid, Klemper mimicked. Strike down the traitor. Then he began to laugh. Falid didn't move. In fact, Falid hadn't moved since he had last helped Klemper climb back to his feet. Falid, the king insisted. Falid is in no condition to. Then Klemper switched to his mimicking voice. Strike down the traitor. Then, returning the way he spoke to its normal timbre, he continued, I killed him about a minute after I entered the room. Falid? Prince Goti turned to the mage advisor and shook his arm. It seemed that Falid had been precariously balanced where he stood. The mere act of the prince touching him caused Falid's clearly dead body to fall backwards, holding the same pose that he had taken behind the king's chair. He fell back stiffly. It was as if rigor mortis had somehow settled in immediately after death. I like to leave nothing to chance, Klemper commented. Why? Jenny asked. Why did you kill Falid? Jenny saw her father put a finger to his lips as she asked the question, evidently worried for his daughter's safety. Why? Why, Princess? Klemper turned his attention to face her. He began to approach her side of the head table. The serving girl with the dagger in her hand followed the mage like a loyal puppy. Isn't it obvious? Falid was a powerful mage. He was a threat to my plans. I had to dispose of him. And Cardos? Jenny asked defiantly. It was clear to her now that Klemper and the serving girl had planned this together. Oh, I hadn't considered Cardos to be much of a threat, to be honest. I was planning for him to eat the food along with everyone else. If only he hadn't discovered it was enchanted. Now I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill all of you. He turned to face the rest of the wedding guests. I do apologise for those of you who did get to eat something of your meals. You see, the enchantment only needs one bite, one swallow. Unfortunately, the enchantment also needs you to sleep on the food you've eaten. Since I've been found out, I can no longer wait for that to happen. Jenny somehow doubted that she was the only one to notice the almost imperceptible nods from some of the servants that were standing closest to the tables. Then Klemper gave the order that was to stick in Jenny's mind for the rest of her life. Kill them. Kill them all. Leave the 5 at the head table. I have other plans for them. No, Jenny screamed. Horse and tiger, no! It was a massacre. Every servant in the hall suddenly had a dagger in her hand and was using it to systematically slaughter the wedding guests. One of the very first casualties was Duke Ganespa. He was an old man sitting alone at a table with a servant hovering close by. The Duke was dead less than a second after Klemper had given the order. The servant gaily hopped over to the next table to help out with the killing there. Jenny's father seemed to do a little better. He was an extremely well-trained and experienced knight and was quite capable of defending himself in unarmed combat. However, he was pinned to his chair and his movement restricted by the proximity of the table. Reye caught the serving girl's dagger arm. He was a big strong knight of the realm, yet somehow the serving girl seemed to be a lot stronger. Reye was hardly able to arrest the speed at which the dagger plunged into his heart. Then the same servant girl killed Jenny's mother, slitting her throat wide open as if she was nothing more than an afterthought. The servants were almost dancing from victim to victim and from table to table, as if they hadn't had so much fun before in their lives. The serving girl who had been standing close to Klemper even went to join in the fun. In fact, the only serving girl who didn't seem to be responding to the bloodlust was Jenny's chambermaid Sue. Sue turned her attention away from the massacre and began to walk slowly towards the archmage Klemper. With the approach of Sue, hope began to fill Jenny's heart. Sue wasn't a member of the kitchen staff. She must have volunteered to help out at the feast. Since she wasn't with the others, Jenny hoped she could be relied on. Perhaps Klemper wouldn't realise that Sue wasn't one of his puppets until it was too late and he was lying on the marble floor in a pool of his own blood. Sue didn't seem to be carrying a weapon, and Jenny hoped that Sue would find something that she could use to strike down the mage with. Maybe once Klemper was dead, they could begin to turn the tide of the battle. If only Sue would move at a faster pace. She seemed to be taking her own sweet time to cross the distance between the serving table where she had been standing and the place where Klemper now stood. Guards! The king was shouting at the top of his lungs. Jenny had the feeling that he'd been shouting for the guards since the massacre began. Guards! No guards were coming. Normally there would be 2 guards stationed just outside the main doors of the great hall, and another few in the passage to the royal quarters. At the very least, some of these guards must have heard the king's cry, but not a single guard appeared to assist the king. Klemper turned his attention to the king. The guards are mine, dear king. They no longer obey you. Something made a loud crash just outside the palace. Whatever it was sounded big, and with it came the distinctive sound of masonry and glass breaking. Jenny was now certain that the city was under attack. You won't get away with this, Prince Goti threatened. There were close to 40,000 soldiers camped around the city, not to mention the soldiers in the barracks of the city itself. Are there? Klemper replied with just a hint of a gleam in his eye. How many are you? Maybe 100? What can your small band of traitors do against such an army? Prince Goti pressed. Klemper gave the prince a menacing smile, saying, Now that really isn't your concern, is it? I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered for this, the king announced. I don't even know if there exists a death painful enough to pay you back for what you've... Oh, shut up, Klemper ordered. He waved his hand, and although the king's mouth continued to move, no words issued forth. I need you alive for now, otherwise you'd be dead already. But why? The prince asked. Why are you turning on your king? Your people? I'm not, Klemper eyed the prince. You see, I'm not exactly human. Not, the prince started. A changeling, Jenny said, startled. Yes, little princess. Klemper looked at Jenny with a smile on his face. But I am a changeling like no other. You see, I lived a full and happy life as a powerful mage in the city of Dabasto, in the elven country of Cassitella. Do you know it? It sits on the coast just across the sea there. The mage pointed east. I've heard of it, Jenny replied, putting as much vitriol into her words as she could manage. There I was, lying on my deathbed, when my master came to me and made me an offer. Klemper then changed his voice, evidently mimicking his master. I will make you young and vital again. I will give you another life to live. In exchange, you will serve me. Little did I know when I agreed that he was going to reduce me to the age of a mere baby, change me to look human, and swap me with a newborn human baby. I kept all my magical power and all my learning, though. After all, there would have been no point in choosing the most powerful mage in Kesitella if I had to start all over again. My master wanted to be certain I was selected to serve the king. That's not possible, Jenny said incredulously. It's possible, Klemper replied. I am the proof. My master has more power than you could ever dream. So why this? Jenny asked. She was trying to keep him busy now that Sue continued to cross the floor. Why did Sue have to take so long about it? Klemper grinned. My master has wanted war with you for a long time. It wasn't an easy task to convince the Emperor to invade, though. 1-1, your soldiers are more than a match for any elven soldier. Then, 6 or 7 years ago, my master arranged through clever manipulation for your army to make an unprovoked attack against the city of Golspon. The Emperor was furious, and my master's long-anticipated war against you started. Even then, the Emperor refused to commit his armies in force, unless my master could promise him that his soldiers would meet with little resistance. The invasion started today, and those noises you hear is the Duberan Navy pounding away at your coastal defences and softening up the city before they land their forces. Which reminds me, a message came for you about 4 days ago, warning of the impending invasion. I intercepted it. I didn't want the 40,000 or so soldiers gathered here for the wedding to have any chance of marching north and meeting the invaders. Jenny's eyes were on Sue. The servant had reached Klemper's side, but she was just standing there. Why didn't she strike him down? Klemper seemed to notice that Sue was standing there. Sue, my brightest student, favourite of all my children. What can I do for you, child? My lord, Sue started. Jenny didn't like the way this was going. Sue was one of them after all. I have served as the little princess's chambermaid for about half a year now. I was wondering, if you have no further use for her, if I might be given the pleasure of ending her life. Sue! Jenny couldn't help being shocked. Sue turned her head to face Jenny. Hello, princess, she replied, and then she dropped a parody of a curtsy. You never did find out what happened to Maggie, did you? No, Jenny said concerned. I killed her, Sue replied. She was in my way. I had to replace her as your chambermaid. Klemper shook his head. I am sorry, Sue. For some reason, my master wishes for this one to be kept alive. Please, my lord, Sue pleaded. I've been looking forward to this day so much. Klemper grinned. He shook his head again and then looked towards where Jenny sat. I can't allow it. But I can't stop you if I don't know what you're doing. He coughed unconvincingly. I'm just going to turn my back on the head table and check these bodies to see if any of them were carrying any vital intelligence. Thank you, master, Sue said. She dropped a real curtsy for the archmage and then turned attention fully on Jenny. A dagger now appeared in her hand. True to his word, Klemper turned his back on the scene and began to go through the pockets of the dead. Jenny watched Sue carefully as she moved through the tables filled with the dead bodies of her wedding guests. Before long, Sue was skirting the head table itself. She was almost like a huntress stalking her prey, and had Jenny been stuck in the chair, like all the other guests, there would have been nothing she could have done about it. Jenny turned quickly in her chair, and immediately showed Sue just how helpless she really was. A quick gesture, and the magic words, "Go to sleep," and nothing happened. Sue pounced, her dagger slashing wildly. Jenny in her chair toppled over backwards with Sue on top of both. What seemed strange to Jenny was that Sue was strong, very strong. It took both of Jenny's arms to hold back Sue's dagger arm. Despite this, Sue didn't seem to be very capable, and before long it was Jenny who had possession of the blade. The fight didn't last long after that. There, on the floor of the great hall of the royal palace, hidden from the view of Klemper and the other serving girls by the tablecloth that draped the head table, Jenni dispatched her opponent. She pushed Sue's body off of her and lay on the floor for a moment, trying to catch her breath. Her heart was beating fast as adrenaline continued to flood her system. "Is it over?" Klemper shouted. "It's over," Jenni called back. She did her best to sound as much like Sue as she could. "Good," Klemper replied. "Now, get back to your duties." "Yes, master," Jenni responded. She daren't move. The moment she stood up, the servants would see that she wasn't Sue, and would more than likely avenge their fallen comrade. She wished Mangloss had been more forthcoming with teaching her offensive spells, though what spell could she deploy against a mage who could control people with a fault? It also bothered her that her sleep spell hadn't worked. Admittedly, she had been under a lot of pressure when she had cast that spell, what with the massacre of so many people, and the attempt on her own life. But she was sure she had cast that spell correctly. Maybe her wedding ring had stopped her from casting. Jenni noticed that the prince had managed to turn his head enough to see her. She lifted a finger to her mouth, trying to signal him to stay quiet. The prince's eyes drifted to the side, to where Sue's body lay. Then he looked back at Jenni and let his eyes drift again, as if he was trying to tell her something. Jenni turned to look at Sue's body. Sue was no longer a dead serving girl. Her body had changed. Sue had been a harpy. The servant's clothing that Sue had worn had vanished. The harpy was naked except for the white gloves. What about the other servants? Might they also be harpies? It would explain their strength and maybe even their attitude to killing. How did they get into the palace? Surely they didn't fly, they would have been seen. Klemper was a mage, a powerful mage. Jenni reasoned he must have teleported them into the palace. It would have taken time. There were more than 50 servants, and what if the guards were also Klempers as he claimed? How could Klemper have found the time, especially since he had been so sick this last year? Jenni paused as she realised she had just answered her own question. She glanced again at Sue's corpse and the gloves. What was special about the gloves? Jenni removed the gloves from the corpse. There, on one of the fingers, sat a small ring, the bulge of which Jenni remembered seeing so long ago. She remembered she had assumed it was a wedding ring. The ring now glowed with a soft blue light, indicating to her that it was magical in nature. Clearly, in order to work, it had to be touching living flesh. Otherwise, a dead harpy lying beside her wouldn't have reverted to her natural form. Presumably, the ring also had to be the source of the servant's clothing. "So," Klemper called, "what's keeping you?" "Just having a little fun, master," Jenni replied quickly. "Don't be too long," Klemper insisted. Jenni could hear him muttering "harpies" under his breath. Feeling she had to move, Jenni grabbed the ring quickly and slipped it onto her own finger, swapping it with her wedding ring in case the latter should stop it from working. She didn't feel any different, nor was she sure that she looked any different. After all, the ring was intended for a harpy, and it might not change her outward appearance. The magical servant's clothing that was created by the ring vied for dominance with Jenni's own wedding attire. Jenni removed the ring, and then, with the dagger, she set about removing some of the more frilly parts of her wedding gown. "So," Klemper insisted, "don't make me come over there." "Sorry, master," Jenni responded, still trying to emulate Sue's voice. Jenni put the ring back on, and this time the servant clothing appeared over the remains of her wedding dress. Before climbing to her feet, she put on the gloves that Sue had been wearing. There was something special about these gloves, something that seemed to hide the blue glow that was coming off the ring. No wonder she hadn't been able to spot that it had been magical all those months ago. Now was the moment of truth. Would Klemper be fooled, or would he see through Jenni's disguise instantly? Well, she couldn't lie here all day. She climbed slowly to her feet. She couldn't help but look down at the body of the harpy. All it would take would be for Klemper, or indeed any of the servants, to walk around this side of the table, and the game would be over. "Your wife is dead, Prince," Klemper crowed. "Bastard," the prince yelled back with feeling. He couldn't help but glance towards Jenni as she made her way round the end of the table. Jenni hoped he didn't do anything that might give her away. "Come here, Sue, child," Klemper cooed softly. "You can help me decide on whom to kill next." "It will be a pleasure," Jenni replied. It was hard for Jenni to keep up the pretense as she walked slowly around the front of the table. Everywhere she looked was the body of someone she had known. Friends, and relatives of distant courts. Her mother and father were dead. Now she felt glad that her brothers hadn't made it to her wedding. Her grandfather was dead, Cardos the Great, Sir Votrion. Even the youngest child at the wedding, a baby brought by Duke Gafani and his lovely wife, had been butchered. Jenny took her place next to Klemper and looked up at him as adoringly as she could manage. Under the circumstances now, she just needed something to distract him, and she had thrust the dagger into his black heart. "Welcome, my child," Klemper said. "I need the king and the little princeling alive. The two girls are expendable. Who do you think we should kill next?" "It's a hard choice, father," Jenny said. She tried to put as much feeling into the words as she could. "I want to see them both suffer." Klemper glanced down at her. "There's something different about you today, my daughter. I should have realized it earlier. You just gave yourself away." "Father?" Jenny said. "Yes," Klemper replied. "My children call me master, not father. You've been caught out, my dear. Get the better of Sue in the battle, did you?" Seconds. That was how long it took Klemper to see through her disguise. Mere seconds. Feeling she now had nothing to lose, Jenny turned to face Klemper, and she thrust her dagger right towards his chest. Her blade never reached him. She was frozen on the spot, leaning forward in mid-thrust, perhaps just a little off balance. Klemper laughed. Nice try. He took the dagger from Jenny's outstretched hand and then let her go. Jenny staggered forward a step. She regained her balance and then turned to face Klemper again. Thinking Klemper had made a fatal mistake in releasing her, she drew a quick sigil in the air and then muttered the magic words, "Go to sleep." Once again the spell seemed to fail her. "No, my dear," Klemper remarked. "You see, those gloves are made of a special material. While not inherently magical of themselves, they do seem to be able to block any magical power. You'll have to take them off if you want to use your fingers to cast." "But the ring," Jenny said doubtfully. For the moment Klemper seemed willing to talk. "The ring is worn under the gloves. Its effects aren't blocked, but its glow is hidden. Even the most powerful of mages wouldn't have seen it through the fabric." "I'd have thought gloves like this would be very rare," Jenny said. "Rare and expensive," Klemper replied. "But I've already told you about my master. He has resources beyond the dreams of most misers. Outside the palace, the ongoing battle between the harbour catapults and the Jubaran navy seemed to have only gotten louder and louder as the hour had passed. Rocks were hitting the city in great numbers, and by the sound of it, they were hitting closer and closer. Jenny hated to think it was because the harbour defences had already fallen, but right now she had more pressing matters to consider. "I feel it only fair to mention," Klemper explained to Jenny, grabbing hold of his staff in both hands, "the gloves are on your hands. They only stop you from casting. So long as I don't target your hands, I should have no problem in ending your life." "Then what good are they?" Jenny asked. "They hide the magical glimmer from rings. I gave them to my servants in order to stop any mage from asking any awkward questions before I was ready to strike," Klemper explained. "Now, I've wasted enough time with you. Prepare to die." Klemper pointed his staff towards Jenny and started to cast the spell.